This is perhaps one of the most challenging questions. If someone's going to lead well in the body of Christ, then thinking through how we help others to overcome barriers to spiritual growth becomes key. I would suggest that one of the first things to do is for any leader in the body of Christ, anybody who is then seeking to disciple others and help others to maturity, they have to understand first of all how they themselves have grown and how they themselves are continuing to grow. So one of the very key things that any leader in the body of Christ can do to help others overcome barriers to growth is to share how they themselves do it. Paul talks about this in 1 Timothy 4 when he says to Timothy that he is to let his progress be seen by everybody. And that encouragement to let your progress be seen means that Paul is basically saying to Timothy, you need to be appropriately vulnerable so people can see what life is really like, and then they can see how you are really growing, how the gospel applies to your life. We've ended up with this bizarre, absurd situation often in churches and in Christian organizations where leaders have, usually implicitly rather than explicitly, bought into a way of leading that says something like this: let me tell you how much you need Jesus, whilst at the same time showing you how little I need him. We've developed this way of thinking of leadership that says I must somehow show how great I am and how great my life is and how sorted I am. Actually, Paul says precisely the opposite, and he demonstrates it. That's why in 2 Corinthians particularly, Paul has been really criticized by the Corinthians because he hasn't played the game of trying to show how great he is. Instead, he's actually been rather honest about what's really going on in his life. So I think one of the first things that any leader can do to help others to grow is to show others how they themselves are growing. And that is to share something of, here's what's going on in my life, here's how I am walking with Jesus through that. And that then helps others by showing by example. Others need to not just hear how to grow, they need to see it in others. So that would be the very first thing. Beyond that, I think it's an issue of understanding people, understanding scriptures, and understanding what are the common barriers to growth. So recognizing some of the diagnostic signs of legalism, or on the other hand, antinomianism, that it doesn't matter what we do. Recognizing the features of somebody who's struggling with bitterness or unforgiveness. Recognizing where somebody is got areas in their life where they're not submitted to the Lordship of Christ. Now, these are all areas requiring great wisdom and discernment, so that when we're talking about helping people through barriers to growth, we're talking about a prayerful, wise discernment of what might be going on, a constant crying out to God, help me understand here so that I can serve your purposes. And that discernment and that trying to help someone through barriers then has to be backed, I think, with a lifetime of study and reflection on scriptures primarily, but also on, there's a lot of excellent material out there that helps us understand some of the common problems. I've mentioned some of them already, like bitterness, like lack of submission to the Lordship of Christ. The issues of legalism, for example, are enormously important to understand theologically what's going on there, and then practically how we might help people through them. But the picture that I would build as we're thinking about how we're helping people is of a person who would want to be faithful in discipling others to maturity, giving their life to study, to prayer, to thinking about how they might help others. But even more fundamentally than that, simply loving people and making themselves available to God to speak into, to love, to serve other people.